If you've priced out a new computer, upgraded a laptop, or even glanced at graphics card prices recently, you've probably noticed something strange happening. Prices are climbing fast. And this time, it isn't a chip shortage like the one we saw a few years ago. This time it's memory. Plain, ordinary RAM, the component sitting inside literally every computer, phone, and server on Earth, just went through one of the most violent price spikes the industry has seen in years. According to Taiwan-based research firm TrendForce, contract prices for conventional DRAM memory jumped 90% to 95% in the first quarter of 2026 alone. A figure TrendForce itself revised upward mid-quarter from an already steep initial estimate of 55% to 60%, as the underlying supply squeeze turned out to be worse than even industry analysts had expected. Instead of cooling off, prices spiked again the following quarter, climbing another 58% to 63% on top of that. Do the math on 2 consecutive quarters like that, and by some measures, individual chip prices had roughly tripled by mid-2026, with spot prices for some components reportedly hitting record highs above $42 per chip by early August, according to industry tracking. Samsung, SK, Hynix, and Micron, the 3 companies that have dominated global memory manufacturing for decades, are watching this happen in real time. And there's a very specific reason they can't simply flip a switch and fix it. Before getting into why this is happening, it's worth understanding just how deeply RAM prices ripple through the entire economy, because this isn't simply a story about PC building getting more expensive for hobbyists. Every laptop, every smartphone, every data center server, every modern car, essentially every piece of consumer and industrial technology manufactured today contains memory chips. When the underlying cost of that memory spikes this much, manufacturers across every one of those product categories face a real choice: absorb the cost and watch margins shrink, or pass it along to consumers through higher prices. Historically, when memory costs spike this dramatically, manufacturers absorb what they can for a quarter or two using existing inventory, then start passing the rest along. Apple has already moved in that direction. The company announced an across-the-board price increase on Mac computers, iPads, and other devices in mid-2026, directly citing rising component costs, meaning this specific price spike is likely to show up in the cost of considerably more than just RAM sticks PC builders buy directly. That's exactly why a price movement in a component most people never think about directly ends up mattering so broadly. There's a timing lag worth understanding here too, since it affects how this story actually plays out for consumers in practice. Major PC manufacturers like Dell and HP typically purchase memory in bulk roughly a year in advance of anticipated demand, which is part of why standalone memory kit prices tripled well before most pre-built desktop and laptop pricing visibly moved. As that pre-spike bulk inventory gradually depletes, and manufacturers return to the market to restock at current, dramatically higher prices. The increase works its way into finished product pricing with a delay measured in months rather than happening all at once. That mechanism is part of why the full consumer impact of this specific price spike likely hadn't fully hit retail shelves as of mid-2026, even though the underlying component costs had already risen dramatically months earlier. Smartphone manufacturers face a related but distinct version of this pressure. Memory now represents roughly 30% to 40% of a smartphone's total bill of materials cost, according to industry analysis, up sharply from the historical norm of just 10% to 15%. A shift that's applying particular margin pressure to mid-range Android device makers competing on razor-thin profit margins. Here's the core dynamic driving this entire story, and it starts with an industry most people associate with chatbots and image generators, not memory chips, artificial intelligence. Modern AI systems, particularly the massive data centers training and running today's most advanced AI models, consume staggering amounts of a specific premium memory category called high bandwidth memory, or HBM, along with considerable quantities of high-speed server-grade DRAM. As AI infrastructure spending has exploded, demand for exactly these premium memory categories has surged right alongside it. Critically, these premium products carry dramatically higher profit margins for manufacturers than the conventional everyday DRAM used in ordinary consumer PCs and laptops. Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron responded to that shift the way any profit-driven company would. They redirected manufacturing capacity toward higher-margin AI memory products. TrendForce analysts have specifically noted that suppliers are prioritizing incremental supply for high-capacity server memory modules used in AI infrastructure, deliberately at the expense of consumer-grade DRAM. That's a rational business decision from each individual company's perspective. But when all 3 of the industry's dominant manufacturers make essentially the same capacity shifting decision around the same time, the conventional memory market that consumer electronics actually depends on suddenly finds itself with meaningfully reduced supply. Precisely the kind of imbalance that sends prices spiking the way we've seen play out over these past several quarters. It's worth being specific about the scale of this reallocation. Reporting on the shortage, sometimes nicknamed Remageddon in industry and consumer press, indicates SK Hynix had secured demand for its entire 2026 RAM production capacity as far back as October 2025, well before this specific price spike accelerated. JP Morgan Global Research has separately estimated that DRAM prices overall will have risen more than 400% from the start of 2024 through the end of 2026, once the full multi-year run of this cycle is accounted for, a figure considerably larger than just the 2-quarter spike this specific video is focused on. And useful context for understanding this isn't a brief, isolated event. It's also worth explaining what high-bandwidth memory actually is and why it commands such a premium, since the term does a lot of work in this story without most viewers having a clear picture of it. Unlike conventional DRAM, which sits as separate chips on a memory stick connected to a processor through a standard set of wires, HBM stacks multiple memory dies vertically and connects them to the processor through thousands of extremely short, extremely dense internal connections, dramatically increasing the speed at which data can move between memory and compute. That manufacturing process is considerably more complex than conventional DRAM production, requires different fabrication equipment and expertise, and produces a component AI accelerator makers like NVIDIA are willing to pay substantially more for, since HBM directly determines how fast an AI chip can actually process the massive data sets involved in training and running large models. The financial results bear this out clearly. Micron reported that net income nearly tripled in a recent quarter. Samsung projected its December quarter operating profit would nearly triple as well. And SK Hynix's stock has surged enough in South Korea that the company began considering a U.S. stock market listing. All of it driven substantially by HBM and premium. Server memory demand specifically, rather than the conventional memory segment that's actually experiencing the shortage consumers feel most directly. This is exactly the gap Chinese memory manufacturer CXMT has been stepping into, and it's worth being precise about the role the company is actually playing here rather than overstating it. CXMT isn't the primary cause of this price spike. That distinction matters, and we'll come back to it. But the company has been positioning itself as a genuine alternative supplier, specifically in the conventional memory segment that Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron have been deprioritizing in favor of premium AI memory products. CXMT's rise over the past year has been genuinely dramatic, and the specific numbers are worth stating precisely rather than vaguely. The company, formerly known as Changshin Memory Technologies and based in Hefei, China, held roughly 7.67% of the global DRAM market as of the fourth quarter of 2025, according to figures in its own IPO prospectus, with Morningstar analysts projecting that share could climb toward 10% during 2026. On July 27, 2026, CXMT debuted on Shanghai's STAR market after raising 57.92 billion yuan, or roughly $8.6 billion, making it Asia's largest IPO of the year. Shares surged as much as 466% to 531% above the offering price on debut day, pushing CXMT's market capitalization to somewhere between $490 billion and $543 billion, depending on the exact measurement point, instantly making it mainland China's most valuable publicly traded company, overtaking Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. It's worth putting that scale in perspective. Even at roughly $500 billion, CXMT's valuation still trailed SK Hynix's approximately $881 billion market cap, and Micron's a roughly $1 trillion valuation at the time, meaning CXMT had become enormously valuable and symbolically significant, without yet matching its two Korean and American rivals in absolute scale. The IPO itself drew extraordinary investor demand. Bloomberg reported the offering was oversubscribed by roughly 212 times, and CXMT swung to an operating profit of 35.43 billion yuan in the first quarter of 2026, a dramatic reversal from a 2.83 billion yuan loss the same quarter a year earlier, driven directly by the same AI-fueled pricing environment squeezing consumers. The market reaction to CXMT's debut rippled well beyond the company itself. Shares of Micron, Western Digital, and SanDisk all fell sharply in the days following the listing, reportedly down roughly 9%, 7%, and 14% respectively, as investors priced in the possibility of intensifying Chinese competition, even though CXMT currently has no meaningful presence in NAND flash storage. The specific product category SanDisk and Western Digital focus on most heavily. That's worth noting as its own small example of the broader pattern this story is about. Markets sometimes reprice an entire competitive sector based on a single company's symbolic milestone, well ahead of that company actually competing directly in every affected product category. It's also true, and directly relevant to this story, that Apple has been evaluating CXMT memory chips for potential use in iPhones and MacBooks, according to Reuters reporting, with an initial focus specifically on devices sold within China. Apple has reportedly sought approval from U.S. authorities to use these chips in China market products. This detail comes with a genuinely significant complication the original telling of this story leaves out entirely. CXMT is currently listed on a U.S. Pentagon blacklist over alleged ties to the Chinese military, and in late July 2026, a bipartisan group of U.S. lawmakers, including Republican Jim Banks and Democrat Chuck Schumer, sent a formal letter urging Apple CEO Tim Cook to abandon any effort to source chips from blacklisted Chinese suppliers like CXMT and fellow memory maker YMTC. The lawmakers' letter specifically warned that such a move would ensure the world's most valuable consumer electronics company grows dependent on critical supplies from a firm the U.S. government has formally designated as a Chinese military company. Tim Cook, when asked directly by the Wall Street Journal about sourcing Chinese memory chips, responded that everything needs to be on the table, and that Apple should look at all supply, signaling the company sees this as a live option despite the political friction, not a settled decision either way. It's also worth noting that Apple isn't alone here. Dell and HP have reportedly been testing CXMT memory chips as well, as multiple major electronics makers look for additional supply sources beyond the traditional big three. Whether Apple ultimately proceeds with CXMT as a qualified supplier, given the Pentagon blacklist status and direct congressional pressure, remains genuinely unresolved as of this video and should not be presented as a done deal. Here's where it's worth being genuinely careful, because it would be easy to oversimplify this into a story where China single-handedly caused a global memory crisis, and that's not what's actually happening. The primary driver behind this price spike is overwhelmingly the AI industry's surging demand for premium memory products, pulling manufacturing capacity and investment attention away from conventional DRAM across the entire industry, Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron included, entirely independent of anything China specifically has done. CXMT's rise is better understood as a company capitalizing on an opportunity that already existed, rather than the underlying cause of the shortage in the first place. If CXMT didn't exist at all, conventional memory prices would almost certainly still be spiking dramatically right now, driven by the exact same AI-related capacity reallocation happening across the established manufacturers. What China's growing role does change is what happens next. Specifically, how quickly this supply squeeze might eventually ease, and which companies end up capturing the resulting market share once it does. It's worth being honest, though, about a limiting factor on how much relief CXMT can realistically provide in the near term. Analysts quoted by Australia's ABC News have specifically cautioned that CXMT is unlikely to flood the global market with cheap chips in the short run because its output remains largely pre-committed, mostly to Chinese domestic customers, rather than being freely available to ease shortages in markets like the US, Europe, or Australia. Ellie Wang, an analyst at TrendForce, has framed CXMT's growing role somewhat differently, noting that shortages in memory have become more difficult to resolve quickly, which is also why more consumer electronics companies are considering CXMT as an additional supplier, a genuinely useful source-attributed framing that treats CXMT as one contributing factor in an eventual resolution, not a singular fix. It's also worth noting the reception this listing received from independent industry analysts, since opinions genuinely diverge on how significant it is longer term. Yi Capital CEO Theodore Shou told CNBC he had no doubt CXMT would grow into not only a challenger, but a global champion in the memory sector over time. Other analysts, including those quoted by Fortune, struck a more cautious tone, noting explicitly that CXMT's dramatic stock debut does not yet mean China is broadly catching up to the technological sophistication of Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, and that a meaningful part of CXMT's current valuation reflects AI-driven shortage conditions specifically, rather than a settled, durable technological parity with its established rivals. It's worth understanding exactly why Samsung, despite being one of the largest, most sophisticated memory manufacturers on the planet, can't simply reverse this situation quickly, even if it wanted to prioritize conventional memory production again right now. Semiconductor manufacturing capacity isn't something companies can flexibly reallocate overnight. Building new fabrication capacity, or even substantially reconfiguring existing production lines to shift back toward a different product mix, typically takes many months at minimum, often considerably longer, when it involves genuinely new manufacturing capacity rather than simply adjusting an existing line's output ratio. There's also a specific technical wrinkle worth explaining, because it's a detail that rarely makes it into consumer-facing coverage of this shortage. Samsung and SK Hynix have reportedly been accelerating the wind-down of older DDR4 production lines, specifically to free up fabrication capacity for HBM and other advanced node products. That's created a genuinely unusual pricing anomaly, where DDR4, and today aging memory standard being actively phased out, has in some periods appreciated faster in spot markets than the newer DDR5 standard, with spot price increases exceeding 170% reported in early 2026 for some DDR4 products. That's counterintuitive on its face, since older technology typically gets cheaper over time as it's phased out, not more expensive. But it makes sense once you understand the mechanism. DDR4 isn't getting more expensive because demand for it is surging. It's getting more expensive because supply is actively shrinking as manufacturers redirect that same production capacity toward newer, more profitable products, leaving a dwindling pool of DDR4 supply chasing still substantial demand from systems that haven't yet transitioned to DDR5. There's also a straightforward financial incentive question worth acknowledging honestly. Even as conventional memory prices spike dramatically, the AI-focused premium memory segment still likely offers better overall margins for Samsung specifically, meaning the company faces a genuine, not entirely obvious, business decision about how much manufacturing capacity to actually shift back toward conventional memory, versus simply letting conventional memory prices continue climbing while it prioritizes its most profitable product lines. Notably, both Samsung and SK Hynix have publicly warned that AI-driven memory shortages could persist until 2027 and beyond, according to reporting from Tom's Hardware. A warning straight from the companies themselves rather than outside speculation, and one that suggests neither company is planning a rapid pivot back toward conventional memory anytime soon. Given that context, it's worth being concrete about what would actually need to happen for conventional memory prices to meaningfully ease, rather than leaving that as vague, open-ended uncertainty. The most straightforward path involves genuinely new manufacturing capacity coming online, whether from established players building entirely new, production facilities dedicated to conventional memory, or from competitors like CXMT continuing to scale their own production meaningfully beyond current levels. Either path takes real time. Building genuinely new semiconductor fabrication capacity from the ground up typically takes several years from initial planning through actual production ramp-up. CXMT has stated it plans to use the bulk of its IPO proceeds specifically to fund mass production of additional memory wafers, which is a genuine, concrete step in that direction rather than a vague growth ambition, though the actual capacity increase from that investment will still take time to materialize into shipped product. There is a genuinely encouraging data point worth adding here that the original telling of this story didn't have access to. TrendForce's most recent projections, published in July 2026, show conventional DRAM contract prices are expected to rise only 13% to 18% quarter over quarter in the third quarter of 2026. Still a substantial increase, but a marked slowdown from the roughly 60% jump recorded in the second quarter. TrendForce specifically attributes this cooling to consumer and PC maker buyers reaching an affordability ceiling, with manufacturers accumulating meaningful inventory during the first half of 2026 and becoming less willing to accept another round of steep increases, forcing suppliers to take a more flexible approach in contract negotiations. NAND flash storage pricing shows a similar pattern, with growth cooling to a projected 10% to 15% for the same quarter. That's a genuine, if partial, signal that the most extreme phase of this specific spike may already be behind us, even though absolute prices remain dramatically elevated compared to where they started. The original transcript presents this price spike as an open-ended, still accelerating crisis with no signs of slowing. More recent TrendForce data from July 2026 indicates the rate of increase has already begun decelerating meaningfully by Q3 2026, even though prices are still rising in absolute terms and remain far above pre-spike levels. Even so, industry executives remain cautious about calling this over. Pacer's CEO has publicly said he expects severe shortages to persist into at least the middle of 2027, and neither Samsung nor SK Hynix has signaled an imminent pivot back toward prioritizing conventional memory. It's also worth noting that not every corner of the memory market is behaving identically. TrendForce has separately observed that demand for certain graphics memory products, including GDDR7, tied to NVIDIA's newest professional graphics cards, has come in weaker than expected, and that softer notebook shipments have eased pressure in that specific segment, even as server and AI-focused memory demand continues climbing largely unabated. A reminder that this shortage isn't uniform across every single memory product category simultaneously. My honest read on this entire situation is that it's a genuinely useful case study in how a shortage in one seemingly unrelated part of the technology industry, artificial intelligence infrastructure demand, can ripple outward and dramatically affect prices across products that have nothing directly to do with AI at all. Most people buying a new laptop right now have no direct interest in AI data center buildouts, and yet that exact demand surge is a meaningful part of why their next purchase costs noticeably more than it would have a year earlier. Where China's role in this story gets genuinely interesting isn't as the cause of the shortage, which it clearly isn't, but as the beneficiary of an opportunity the established players inadvertently created by chasing more profitable products elsewhere. CXMT stepping into exactly the market segment Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron have been deprioritizing represents precisely the kind of opportunistic, well-timed positioning that's allowed the company to go from a minor catch-up manufacturer to a genuine competitive force in a remarkably short window, riding a wave established industry giants themselves set in motion, rather than one China specifically engineered from the outset. There's a broader lesson worth taking from this, one that applies well beyond memory chips. Markets rarely stay static for long, and a shift in priorities among a small handful of dominant players, even a rational, individually sensible shift, like chasing higher AI-related margins, can create genuine openings for competitors that didn't previously seem like serious threats at all. So here's what I want to know from you. If you're in the market for a new computer right now, does this pricing story change your timeline? Buying sooner to beat further price increases, or waiting to see whether increased competition from manufacturers like CXMT eventually helps bring prices back down? I'd genuinely like to know where you land. Drop your take in the comments below. I rate every single one. If you want to keep following exactly how this memory price story develops, along with everything else unfolding across China's rapidly growing semiconductor manufacturing industry, that's exactly what this channel covers every single week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Because this specific story has real direct consequences for anyone buying electronics over the coming months, and given how quickly the numbers in this story have already shifted between the start of this year and now, it's very likely we'll be updating this exact figure again before the year is out. See you in the next video.